Indistinguishable Part 2. White War. March 11th, 2026. Table of Contents. Part 1. The Coincidence Engine, in which nothing appears to be happening. Part 2. White War, in which the conflict is named by someone who died centuries ago. 6. The Doctrine, the Takiya reinterpretation, not a lecture but a document, found in the cluster's search logs, queried by the anonymous commission before Layla ran her first model. Passive shield becomes active mask. The practitioner who does not hide but becomes indistinguishable. The mask that becomes the face. The first sense of how long this has been in preparation. 7. Ibn Maymun's theorem, the mythic strategist. The abode of unbounded war. White is the color of peace that isn't. Delivered as archival fragment woven alongside live drone telemetry, a medieval text, and a real-time swarm tracking data juxtaposed on the same screen, the novel's deepest temporal layer becoming visible. The conflict is older than the infrastructure conducting it. 8. The overlap, how conflict operates when combatants are indistinguishable from citizens. The battlefield shifts inward, not metaphor, an institutional face, a real surveillance apparatus, a defending state that begins watching its own population and in doing so damages the social trust that was the actual prize. The strategic paradox made concrete. 9. The drone season, contemporary drone warfare, Red Sea, Strait of Hormuz, the autonomous swarms. Not backdrop, active mechanism. The drones are running pattern recognition identical in logic to what Layla is running in the sub-basement. 2 instruments, 2 institutional positions, 1 field. The parallel made structural. 10. Bait, the geopolitical crisis was engineered. Not to destroy a tanker. To observe who coordinated without being told to. The retroactive reframing of Part 1. The Cairo Star was a controlled experiment, and 17 people passed it without knowing they were being tested. The question this raises about who was watching the watchers. Part 3. The accidental conspiracy, in which people find each other without trying. Part 4. The field, in which the technology and the organism become hard to tell apart. Part 5. The Dubai Labyrinth, in which the city reveals what it was built to hide. Part 6. The Pirate Decision, in which the question becomes, for whom? Final Act. The Threshold. Neither side started the war. The war started itself. Indistinguishable. Part 2. White War, in which the conflict is named by someone who died centuries ago. Chapter 6. The Doctrine. She read it properly on a Thursday. Not the 3 pages she had read standing up. Not the scanning she had done in the hour after she found it. Not the fragments she had carried in her mind through the conversation with Abraham and Tam and back down to the chamber. Properly. From the beginning. With the document open on the terminal and the thermos on the desk and no other file running, and the specific quality of attention she reserved for things that required more than analysis. That required, she had learned to recognize, a kind of reading that was less like extracting information and more like being changed by an argument. It was a long document. The monograph she had found on day 11 in the cluster's search logs ran to 118 pages in full, not the 43 she had initially counted, because the initial 43 were the main text and the remainder was apparatus, footnotes, an extended bibliography, 3 appendices, and a section at the back that the table of contents listed as primary source translations and which she had not reached before. She started at the beginning. A note on method. This monograph does not argue a position. It describes 1. The reinterpretation of Takiya from concealment doctrine to operational architecture is not a proposal. It is a historical observation. The transformation occurred. It was completed, in its foundational form, by a single practitioner over a period of 30 years and was documented, by that practitioner, in a series of working papers that are the primary sources for this study. The papers were not published. They were not intended to be. They were written for a specific reader who did not yet exist and were placed, by their author, in an archive structured to make them findable by that reader when the reader arrived. The author of those papers understood that their argument would not be credible until the infrastructure existed to demonstrate it. They were patient in the way that people are patient when they believe the infrastructure is coming. It has come. She read that 3 times and then read on. The original doctrine was theological and protective. The permission, and it was a permission, not a command, a dispensation offered to those under genuine existential threat, to conceal one's beliefs, one's identity, one's affiliation when concealment was the only available protection against destruction. The practitioner who told the persecutor what the persecutor wanted to hear. The community that assembled in the visible forms of the dominant culture while maintaining, in the interior spaces of home and memory and private practice, the faith that had been declared illegal. Not apostasy, its opposite. The faith preserved by the face that denied it. The doctrine was old. The word older than the juridical form it had been given. The impulse, the monograph argued, as old as any condition of power differential, which was to say as old as the first moment one group recognized that another group had something it wanted and the means to take it. The permission to deceive the powerful to protect the powerless was not a moral refinement. It was an acknowledgement of physics. It described what people would do and gave them a framework in which doing it did not destroy their sense of themselves. For roughly 12 centuries, the doctrine functioned as described. Protective, reactive, its use triggered by threat, bounded by necessity, concluded when the threat passed. The mask removed when the danger ended. The reinterpretation, the monograph argued, began as a question. What if the mask were not removed? Not because the danger persisted. Although, the argument went, the danger did persist, had always persisted, and the periods of its apparent absence were not safety but inattention, but because the mask, worn long enough, ceased to be a mask. Because identity was not a fixed interior fact covered and uncovered by circumstance, but was itself a practice, a continuous performance, a thing made real by its repetition. Because the person who wore the face of an ordinary person for long enough became, in every meaningful sense, the ordinary person, while remaining, in the sense that mattered, the thing the face was designed to conceal. Not concealment. Indistinguishability. The monograph's author drew a distinction the translation rendered as the difference between opacity and transparency. The original concealment doctrine produced opacity, the practitioner hidden behind an exterior that revealed nothing. The reinterpretation aimed for something more radical. Perfect transparency, the practitioner fully visible, everything about them available for examination, and the examination revealing exactly what it was designed to reveal. Not a closed door, but a window. Not a window onto nothing. A window onto precisely the room the examiner expected to find. She stopped here and made a note. She wrote, "The paranoid apparatus is defeated not by resistance, but by perfect compliance." She looked at it. She crossed out paranoid and wrote modern surveillance, and then crossed that out too and wrote the word that had been waiting. Any. Any apparatus. Any system of examination. Any intelligence operation. Any compliance review. Any behavioral analytics platform. Any model designed to find deviations in a population by measuring each individual against the expected norm. The practitioner of the doctrine did not deviate. The practitioner was the norm. The monograph's second section turned from principle to practice, and the shift in register was marked enough that she paused at the section break and noted the change. The first section had the quality of philosophy, careful, abstract, building an argument from foundational premises. The second section had the quality of a technical manual. It described, in methodological sequence, what was required to construct a life of complete indistinguishability. The word it used, in the original Arabic that the translator's footnotes preserved alongside the English, was bina, construction, the building of a life, not the maintenance of a cover story, which implied something temporary and instrumental, a structure erected for a specific purpose and dismantled when the purpose was served. The bina, the doctrine prescribed, was permanent, total, and self-sustaining, a life constructed to be lived, not performed, in which the construction itself became invisible because the living of it was genuine. The monograph was specific about what genuine meant. It meant actual employment in the stated occupation with the competence and the record and the professional relationships that employment required. It meant actual residence at the stated address, with the neighbors and the local knowledge and the small frictions of ordinary community life that residence produced. It meant actual presence in the networks, familial, social, civic, that the documented identity implied, with the histories and obligations and effects that presence accumulated over time. It meant actual investment in the life being lived. This was the part she read most slowly. The practitioner did not pretend to care about their documented life. They cared. They were a good colleague, a reliable neighbor, a person whose word was trusted in small matters because their word had proven trustworthy in small matters over years. The effective texture of the life was not simulated. The attachment was real. The work was genuinely done well. The relationships were genuinely maintained. The doctrine, as reinterpreted, did not ask the practitioner to live falsely. It asked them to live doubly, to sustain, within the fully real and fully inhabited documented life, a second orientation. Not a second identity, an orientation, a set of commitments, objects of attention, long-term purposes that ran alongside the documented life without contradicting it, without surfacing in it in any way that the apparatus could detect, without ever requiring the practitioner to be anything other than exactly who their documents said they were. The mask that becomes the face that remains underneath a mask. She sat with that paradox for a long time. It was not the logical contradiction it appeared to be on first contact. The monograph was precise about why. The paradox dissolved, the author argued, when you stopped thinking about identity as a layered structure, a real self beneath a false surface, and started thinking about it as something distributed. The practitioner did not have a real self underneath the constructed life. The practitioner was the constructed life, fully and without reservation, and also the thing the life was constructed to contain and protect. Both were real. Neither was prior. The doctrine did not split the self. It expanded it, made it capable of holding two complete orientations simultaneously, neither one concealing or negating the other, each one fully inhabited in the appropriate context. She thought about this in relation to the 47 nodes. People who were exactly who their documents described, whose decisions were locally rational, who could explain every choice they had made in terms of their documented profession and their understood incentives, who were also, in aggregate, in the space between their individual choices, something the apparatus had no category for. She thought, the field does this to people who did not choose it. The doctrine does this to people who did. She thought, what would it look like if the field and the doctrine were operating in the same population simultaneously? She thought, the model could not tell the difference. The third section was the one that carried the weight of the whole. It described what the monograph called Shabaka, network, the plural application. What happened when the doctrine was extended from a single practitioner to a distributed structure, not an organization, which was a category the apparatus was built to find, but something more like what the monograph called, in a phrase that arrived in her reading with the specific impact of a phrase encountered at the correct moment, a field of indistinguishable practitioners. A field. The word in the original Arabic that the translation rendered as field was the word for an agricultural field, the cultivated ground, the medium in which something grew. Not a military field, not a theoretical field, not a computational field. The field in which things were planted and tended and harvested. The field that looked, from the road, exactly like every other field. The monograph's author had used that word in the early 2000s, before quantum behavioral modeling existed, before the vocabulary she worked in daily had been developed, and had meant by it something that, she was sitting very still now, was structurally identical to what she had been calling field effect in her private notes for 3 weeks. The coincidence was not a coincidence. The monograph's author had been working from the doctrine toward a description of what the doctrine could produce at scale. She had been working from the data toward a description of what the data was showing. They had arrived at the same word from opposite directions. She went to the translator's footnote for Shabaka field. The footnote said, the author uses this term in a specific technical sense developed across the primary source papers. The Shabaka field is not a metaphor. It is a description of the relational structure that emerges when a sufficient number of practitioners are operating in the same social environment under the doctrine's principles. The field is not built by the practitioners. It emerges from their co-presence. Each practitioner, operating individually and without communication with other practitioners, generates in their immediate social environment a subtle alteration in the decision-making conditions of those around them. At sufficient density, these alterations overlap, reinforce, and produce, the primary sources argue, a macro-level coherence in the behavior of populations the practitioners are embedded in. Coherence without communication. Coordination without structure. The doctrine's deepest claim is that the Shabaka field, at maturity, becomes self-sustaining, that it continues to operate without the continued active participation of any individual practitioner, because the relational substrate has been altered in ways that persist and propagate. She read the final sentence of the footnote twice. The doctrine's deepest claim is that the Shabaka field, at maturity, becomes self-sustaining. She looked at the indicator lights on the cryogenic towers. She looked at the terminal. She looked at the 53 behavioral profiles scrolling in the monitoring window. She kept open in the corner of the screen the continuous readout of the field in its current expression, people making small decisions in 17 countries, the gradient fields rhyming, the coherence accumulating. She thought, how long does maturity take? She turned to the appendices. The third appendix was the primary source translations. The working papers of the practitioner the monograph described, the person who had taken the doctrine from reinterpretation to operational architecture over 30 years. The papers had been written between 1973 and 2001. There were 11 of them. The translations were numbered, but the originals were not dated in the translation. Only the collection date was given, and the collection date for all 11 was the same, 2003. They had all been retrieved from wherever they had been stored in the same year. She read the first paper. It was short, 7 pages in translation, and written in a register she had not expected, not academic, not technical, not polemical. It read like a letter, not addressed to anyone, not signed, but with the intimate directness of writing produced for a specific reader whose presence the author could feel. It began, I am writing this in the year you will call 1973, though I think of it as the 4th year of the project, because the project is the only timeline that matters to me now. I do not know when you will read this. I am writing for the person who will find it when the infrastructure exists to make use of it, which means I am writing for someone I cannot imagine except by function. Someone who has found the field, who has understood what the field is, and who now needs to understand what has been done to it. I am sorry for that last sentence. It is the most difficult thing I have written, and I wrote it first, before I wrote anything else, because I wanted you to know that I know, that I understood, from the beginning, what it would mean if what I was building was found by the wrong person first. I built it anyway. I built it because the alternative, leaving the field unrecognized, unmapped, available to anyone patient enough and ruthless enough to find it without the framework to understand what they were finding, seemed worse than the risk of building it. I may have been wrong. By the time you read this, you will know whether I was wrong. I will not. She stopped. She sat in the 8-degree cold of the sub-basement with the document on the screen, and she did not move for a while. The writer had known, had understood, in 1973, 50 years before the cluster was initialized, what the field was, had understood the risk, had built something anyway, built it in the direction of whoever would come next, had spent 30 years building it, had placed it in an archive structured to be findable by the right person when the right person arrived, had known that the wrong person might arrive first. She thought about the flagged uncertainty report, the 6 paragraphs. The final paragraph that said the model could not determine whether the behavioral signature in the pre-initialization data represented a threat actor or a principal. She thought, the person who wrote this was the principal. The person who the doctrine produced, who had spent 30 years developing the operational architecture of the Shabaka field, who had built the archive, who had placed the papers there, was the commission. Or was the person behind the commission? The commission was the instrument. The papers were the primary source. The person was 50 years earlier, writing for her. She thought. Or the person who spent 30 years on the operational architecture was not writing in the direction of warning, was writing in the direction of instruction. She went to the second paper. You will want to know how long it takes. I can tell you the answer in numbers, and the numbers will be accurate, but they will not tell you what the numbers mean in the living of it, which is longer than the numbers suggest. 30 years of maintained indistinguishability at the level the doctrine requires is not 30 years of performance. It is 30 years of being the life that was constructed, of caring, genuinely and without reservation, about the neighbor's daughter's illness and the colleague's difficult brief and the civic committee's intractable problem with the drainage on the north side of the road. 30 years of small genuine things. And alongside them, not hidden, not suppressed, not sacrificed to the maintenance of the cover, the work, the long work. The work that no one around you knows you are doing, not because you are hiding it, but because the way you are doing it is indistinguishable from not doing it. This is what the doctrine means by the mask becoming the face. Not that the face replaces the mask, that the distinction stops being available, that you are the neighbor who cares about the drainage and the person building the field, and there is no moment, no boundary, no transition between them. You are both, completely, always. She looked at the terminal, the monitoring window, the 53 nodes. She thought, the person who wrote this was describing their own life, was writing about what it cost, the genuine care, the 30 years of small genuine things alongside the long work. This was not a manual written by someone who found the doctrine useful. This was a testimony written by someone who had been changed by it, expanded by it, in the way the monograph described, and who understood, writing in the direction of the future, that the person who found these papers might themselves be changed in the same way, might find, in reading them, not just information but a kind of orientation, a way of holding two things simultaneously that the ordinary categories of identity did not provide for. She thought about the instruction on the commission document's 6th page. The model should be permitted to flag patterns that conventional analysis would discard as noise. Permitted, not instructed. Permitted. She thought about what it meant to have been placed in this sub-basement, given this cluster, handed these 17 tokens, allowed to read these papers at the moment she was ready to understand them. Not earlier. Not later. Now. The cluster had retrieved the monograph on day 11 of its operation before she arrived. The cluster had been waiting with the monograph for 4 days when she initialized her first model on day 15. The papers had been in the archive since 2003. The monograph had been written sometime in the early 2000s, shortly after the papers were collected. The collection date was 2003. The primary sources ran to 2001. 2 years between the last paper and the collection. 2 years in which someone had gathered the papers, commissioned the monograph, built the archive, structured it to be connectable to whatever instrument would eventually be pointed in the right direction. 2 years in which the person who spent 30 years on the doctrine had, apparently, ceased to write. She went to the last paper. It was dated, the only one of the 11 that was dated. The translation gave the collection notation, final paper. Placed in archive 2001. Original document condition, written in the author's hand on plain paper. No institutional letterhead. No address. No signature. The paper was 4 pages. She read it slowly. I am writing this in what I understand to be the last year of my capacity to add to this record. Not the last year of my life. I am, as of this writing, in reasonable health for my age, which is a fact that has become less interesting to me than it once was. The last year of my capacity to add to the record because I have completed what was completable. The architecture is built. The Shabaka field has reached the density at which it becomes self-sustaining. I know this because I can feel it, which is not a mystical claim, only a description of a practitioner's relationship to their own field. The way a farmer knows the ground has changed because the changed ground is the medium in which they have been working for 30 years and their hands have learned to read it. The ground has changed. What I planted has taken root deeply enough that what happens next does not depend on me. What happens next depends on the person who finds this. I want to say something careful here, and I want you to understand that I am saying it carefully because I love the field and not because I distrust you. I do not know you. I cannot know you. The archive was built to be findable by someone with the tools and the temperament to understand what the field is. It was built with the assumption that the person who found it would find it because the field had guided them to it, that the coherence of the field itself would function, at the moment of sufficient maturity, as a selection mechanism, making findable what needed to be found by the people equipped to find it. That assumption may be wrong. A field, at the density I have built, does not care about the character of the people who find it. It is not a moral instrument. It is a relational substrate, and it amplifies whatever the relationships bring to it, the careful and the careless, the protective and the predatory, the people who find it and want to understand it, and the people who find it and want to use it. I spent 30 years building the field toward its own recognition. I spent 30 years believing that recognition, the field knowing what it was, would be sufficient protection, that a field which could see itself would be able to distinguish between the people who found it in order to understand it and the people who found it in order to extract from it. I am no longer certain that is true. What I am certain of is this. The modification architecture is in the hands of the person who spent the longest looking for it and found it first. I know who that person is. I have known for 11 years. I have watched the project develop with the attention I gave my own, because I understood, 11 years ago, that it was my own, that what I had built was findable by a mind like mine, and that a mind like mine could find it in order to protect it or find it in order to use it. And I could not, from inside my own construction, determine which kind of mind had arrived. I placed the archive in a structure that required, to access fully, a specific kind of instrument. An instrument that did not yet exist when I placed the archive. An instrument that I described, in the third appendix of the monograph I commissioned to accompany these papers, in enough technical detail that the person who built it would know they were building it, and the person who found it would know they were inside it. You are inside it. I do not know, from where I stand, which kind of mind you are. What I know is that the field is large enough now that it contains both kinds. That somewhere in the substrate, in the behavioral data, in the gradient fields, in the patterns that rhyme across distances without communication linkage, the modification architecture is already running. Has been running, in test form, for longer than the instruments existed to detect it. Will be running, in full deployment, within a time frame I can estimate but not specify, because the time frame depends on the progress of the infrastructure, which I have modeled but cannot observe from here. The archive is the map. The cluster is the instrument the map was written for. The field is the territory. What you do with the territory, that is the only question left. I built this for you. I have been sorry about that, and not sorry about it, in the proportions you might expect. I built it because there was no one else to build it, and because leaving the field unmapped seemed worse than mapping it for an unknown reader, and because I believed, still believe, in the way you believe things when belief is the only epistemically honest position available, that the field, given the capacity to see itself, would find the people capable of protecting it. I may have been wrong. Find them anyway. She stayed in the chamber until 3 o'clock. She did not go back up to floor 23. She was not ready to take this to Abraham yet, not because she didn't trust him, but because she needed to know first whether the trust was hers or the field's. Whether she was moving toward him because she had chosen to, or because 30 years of someone else's careful cultivation had made that movement feel like choice. She thought about that distinction for a long time. She thought about whether the distinction was real. She thought about the first paper. I am sorry for that last sentence. The writer who put the apology first, who understood what it would mean to be the person who found this and discovered that the finding had been arranged. She thought about the nodes. 53 people making small decisions in 17 countries, each of them in a life that was exactly what it appeared to be, each of them oriented, in ways they could not account for, towards something they could not name. She thought, how many of them were like her, found by the field, genuinely, in the field's own idiom of spontaneous coherence. She thought, how many of them were like the practitioner, placed, oriented deliberately, a life constructed around the double orientation, the genuine and the purposive, the face and the mask, held simultaneously, the distinction collapsed by decades of practice until even the practitioner might not be certain which was which. She thought, the model cannot tell the difference. She thought, neither can I. At 3 o'clock, she locked the terminal. She put on her jacket. She stood in front of the document a moment longer, the final paper's last line still on the screen. Find them anyway. She turned off the monitor. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby. Not the 23rd floor. Not yet. First, she needed to sit with what it meant that the field was old enough to have a historian. Old enough that someone had spent 30 years inside it, mapping it, building for its future. Old enough that the map had been written before the instrument to read it existed. Old enough that the conflict she had been hired, she now understood, to help resolve, had been in preparation since before she was born. She rode the elevator up through the building's dark and quiet floors. The lobby was empty, the reception desk unstaffed. Through the glass front, she could see the city performing its perpetual and indifferent luminosity, the towers lit, the roads moving, the autonomous vehicles tracing their quiet geometries through the warm Gulf night. A city running 22 minutes ahead of its own optimization systems. A field that had been learning for longer than anyone who found it was prepared to know. She pushed through the glass door and stood in the night air, which was still warm at 3 in the morning, the specific warmth of a city that did not fully cool, that held the day's heat in its glass and its concrete and its accumulated human activity and released it slowly through the night, so that the darkness was always warmer than it should have been. She thought, the conflict is old. The person who named it is dead. The doctrine is still running. She thought, I have been inside it for longer than I knew. She stood in the warm dark for a while. Then she went home. Then she came back in the morning. There was a great deal of work to do, and she had been told and now understood, exactly the right person to do it. That understanding, she thought, walking back through the lobby, was the first moment she was not certain it was hers. Chapter 7. IBN Maimond's Theorem. The swarm data came in at 6:14. She had been at the terminal since 5, not because she had slept and woken and chosen to come in early, but because she had not gone home. She had stood in the warm dark outside the building for 11 minutes the previous night, and then come back through the lobby and ridden the elevator down and sat at the terminal with the last paper's final lines still present in her mind. Find them anyway, and worked until the sub-basement's artificial light became indistinguishable from morning, which was somewhere around 4:30. When the building above her began its slow awakening and the power draw shifted in a way she had learned to feel, as a change in the chamber's ambient vibration. At 5 o'clock she had made tea. At 5:20 she had opened the monitoring window and watched the overnight behavioral accumulation scroll. The nodes in the Asian time zones most active, Singapore and Seoul and Tokyo, producing their small decisions in the hours that were deep night in Dubai, each one a data point and something she was now reading with different eyes. Not for patterns, for character, for the question the last paper had left in her, which kind of mind? At 6:14 the swarm feed pushed an alert. The alert came through FLT, data 0023, one of the 17 opaque feeds, which she had not previously associated with aviation data. She had cataloged it, in her initial survey, as a logistics stream, something involving cargo routing or port operations. She had been wrong, or the feed was layered, carrying multiple data types through the same authentication channel. The alert was tagged priority, elevated and beneath the tag, a real-time visualization she had not known the feed could generate. She looked at it. The visualization was a map, the Gulf, rendered in the cluster's standard geographic projection, north up, the coastlines in dark gray, the water in the blue-black that the system used for open sea. Across the map, moving in real time, were traces, hundreds of them. Each trace a small arrow indicating heading and velocity, each arrow color-coded by a taxonomy she did not immediately recognize: red, amber, green, white, distributed across the Gulf's airspace in a pattern that was, at first glance, the ordinary chaos of a heavily trafficked maritime corridor. At second glance it was not. She pulled the feed's metadata. The traces were autonomous aerial units, drones, in the broad taxonomy, though the feed's classification system used a more granular vocabulary: maritime surveillance platforms, autonomous logistics carriers, naval reconnaissance assets, civil infrastructure monitors, commercial delivery systems, weather observation units. The Gulf's airspace, she now understood, was dense with them. Not tens of units, but hundreds, operating across commercial, civil, and military domains simultaneously, each governed by its own institutional logic, its own routing protocols, its own tasking authority. What the visualization was showing her, the reason for the elevated priority alert, was that 214 of the units currently active in the Gulf's airspace were exhibiting what the feed's anomaly detection layer had flagged as non-task directional coherence. 214 drones, from 17 different operating agencies, were pointing in the same direction. Not flying in formation, not in communication with each other. The feed's communication linkage overlay showed no cross-institutional signaling. Each unit was executing its assigned task, following its programmed routing, operating within its designated corridor. And 214 of them, at this moment, in the course of executing their individual assigned routines, had their sensors oriented, cameras, radar, LiDAR, whatever the unit carried, toward the same 40-degree arc of sky above the Gulf's central shipping lane. The orientation was not a command. It was an emergent property of 214 independent routing decisions, each locally rational, none of them issued by a central authority, none of them communicating with any other. She thought, the drones are nodes. She thought, the field does not require biology. Then she opened ARC, DOC0009, and went to the bibliography she had not yet read, because the last paper had been the thing she needed, and the bibliography had seemed, after the last paper, like aftermath. She went to it now because she had a name, IBN Maimon, that the third appendix's footnote had given her, and that the final paper had not elaborated on, and she wanted the elaboration before she did anything else with the swarm data. The bibliography was organized by category. She found the relevant entry under primary historical sources, pre-modern strategic doctrine. Ibn Maimon al-Qada, dates disputed, FL late 8th, early 9th century CE. Known in Western scholarship, or known at all, under the Latin transliteration Maimonides Strategicus, a confusing designation that has led to persistent misattribution. Distinct from the philosopher Moses ben Maimon, the strategist, author of a body of work reconstructed almost entirely from citations and later sources, as no original manuscripts are confirmed extant. The primary modern study is Al-Rashid, F. 1987. The Abode of Unbounded War, Strategic Doctrine in the Early Abbasid Period. Beirut, Markaz al-Dirasat. Chapters 4-6. See also the fragmentary translation in the archive at Appendix B. She went to Appendix B. Appendix B was 11 pages. It opened with a translator's note explaining that the fragments it contained had been reconstructed from 3 later medieval sources that quoted Ibn Maimon directly, a 12th century military treatise, a 13th century jurisprudential commentary, and a 14th century geographical encyclopedia whose author had, apparently, found Ibn Maimon's strategic framework applicable to questions of territorial taxonomy that were, strictly speaking, outside its original domain. The translator noted that the 3 sources quoted different passages and that no passage appeared in more than one source, which was either remarkable preservation or remarkable selection, and that the translation was conservative. Where the original Arabic was ambiguous, the translation preserved the ambiguity rather than resolving it. She read the fragments in the order Appendix B presented them, which was the translator's judgment of their probable original sequence. Fragment I, from the 12th century treatise, cited in the chapter on the classification of conflict. The first error of those who study war is to believe that war requires declaration. War requires only parties and an object of contention. The declaration is a convenience for historians and a liability for strategists. The strategist who declares announces themselves. The strategist who does not declare preserves every advantage that announcement would sacrifice. The question is not whether undeclared war is war. The question is whether declared war, being war at a disadvantage, deserves the name. She looked at the swarm visualization. Still active. The 214 units still oriented toward the same arc of sky. She had set the feed to alert her if the number changed significantly in either direction. She read on. Fragment 2, from the 12th century treatise, in the same chapter. The practitioner of the White War does not seek to defeat the enemy. Defeat is a concluded state. The concluded state returns the enemy to a condition of freedom, freedom to reconstitute, to reimagine, to return with different orientation and different methods. The practitioner of the White War seeks, instead, the permanent alteration of the enemy's decision-making conditions, not what the enemy decides, how the enemy is capable of deciding. The target is not the will. The target is the ground in which the will grows. She stopped. She looked at that sentence for a long time, with the swarm data scrolling in the monitoring window at the corner of the screen, with the behavioral profiles of 53 nodes accumulating their small decisions, with the final paper's closing line present in her mind. The target is not the will. The target is the ground in which the will grows. She thought about the substrate modification the monograph had described in its 3rd appendix, the material she had read quickly the previous night, in the hours before the cluster's flagged uncertainty report had redirected her attention. She had read it quickly because it was technical in a register she hadn't been ready for yet, dense with specificity about methodology and deployment timelines. She had filed it as something to return to. She was returning to it now, in parallel with Ibn Maimon, and the parallelism was not coincidental, and she did not treat it as coincidental. The ground in which the will grows. The the training weights of the three primary foundation models, the 18 months of changes below the threshold of any audit system's anomaly detection. She read on. Fragment 3, from the 13th century jurisprudential commentary, cited in the chapter on the conditions under which war may be considered to have ended. He said, the abode of war and the abode of peace are not territories. They are conditions. A territory does not become the abode of peace by treaty. It becomes the abode of peace when the conditions for war, the imbalance, the contention, the differential, cease to obtain. Conversely, a territory does not become the abode of war by attack. It becomes the abode of war when the conditions for peace, the balance, the sufficiency, the rough equivalence of standing, are removed. He said, therefore the practitioner of the white war does not attack. The practitioner of the white war alters the conditions, slowly and without visible action, until the territory that was the abode of peace becomes the abode of war, without any act of war having been committed. The practitioner has created a war that cannot be ended because it was never declared, that cannot be defended against because it was never attacked, that cannot be appealed to any tribunal because it was never, in any recognized legal sense, begun. He said, this is what I mean by unbounded. Not unlimited in violence. Unlimited in duration. The swarm alert updated. Not the number. The 214 units were still coherently oriented, the directional pattern holding, but the feed had added a new annotation to the visualization. The 214 units collective sensor orientation had, in the 20 minutes since she first looked at the feed, described a slow arc. Not random. Not the drift you would expect from 214 independent units executing individual routines. A coherent rotation, 4.7 degrees over 20 minutes. Tracking. She pulled the overlay, tracking the position of a specific vessel in the Gulf Central Lane. The vessel's AIS identifier. A Panamax-class crude carrier currently in transit from Fujairah toward the Strait of Hormuz. Not the Kairos Star. A different ship. A routine transit. Nothing in the vessel's manifest, its routing, its cargo documentation that she could find in the time she took to look would explain why 214 autonomous aerial units from 17 different agencies were, without communication or coordination, orienting their sensors toward it. She looked at the vessel's AIS record. She looked at its history. Routine. Unremarkable. 41 transits through the Gulf in the past 3 years, each one logged, each one completed without incident. She looked at the vessel's name. Kairos Star 2. A replacement vessel, commissioned after the first was damaged. The same owner, the same route, the same name with a Roman numeral appended. The commercial world's unsentimental notation of continuity. The original burned and the replacement already running, because the world did not stop needing the oil while the insurers settled the claim. She looked at the swarm data. 214 units. No communication. No coordination. Pointing. She thought, the field is watching. She went back to the fragments. Fragment 4, from the 14th century Geographical Encyclopedia, cited in the chapter on the classification of territories according to their strategic conditions. The geographer who came after him wrote, Ibn Maimon said that white is the color of the abode of peace because white is the color of the surface that reflects everything and reveals nothing. The white wall tells you what is in front of it. It tells you nothing of what is behind it. The wall that looks like peace is the wall that has already become war, because the war is behind the reflection and the peace is only what the wall shows you of yourself. The geographer noted that this troubled him and that he wrote it down because trouble was a signal worth recording. She sat with that. White is the color of the surface that reflects everything and reveals nothing. She thought about the swarm of drones tracing their invisible highways above the Gulf, each one doing exactly what it was assigned to do, each one a piece of infrastructure so ordinary, so completely integrated into the operational fabric of the modern maritime environment, that the idea of them as a coherent system, as something that could point, collectively and without instruction, in a specific direction, would not occur to anyone who had not seen what she had just seen. She thought about the concealment doctrine, the practitioner who was completely visible, completely legible to the apparatus, and therefore invisible in the only sense that mattered. She thought about Ibn Maimon, writing in the early 9th century, 1,200 years ago, give or take the disputed dates, about a form of conflict that could not be declared, could not be ended, could not be defended against, because it operated in the domain of conditions rather than actions, because it worked not on the will but on the ground in which the will grew. She thought about the training weights of 3 foundation models, the 18 months of changes, the subtle alteration, patient, precise, below the detection threshold, of the informational environment in which 3 billion people formed their understanding of the world. Not what they decided, how they were capable of deciding. The ground. She opened a new file. She did not yet know what the file was for. She titled it IBN Maimon and began writing. Not analysis, not annotation, but something closer to transcription. She was trying to get the thing outside of her head and into a form that could be examined, because the thing in her head was acquiring a density she needed to distribute across language before she could think clearly about its implications. She wrote, Ibn Maimon describes a form of conflict that is 1. Undeclared, not as a tactical choice, but as a structural feature. The conflict cannot be declared without ceasing to be itself. 2. Unlimited in duration, not because the practitioners are committed to perpetuity, but because the form of the conflict forecloses the conditions under which it could end. You cannot negotiate the end of a war that was never begun. You cannot defend against an attack that took the form of conditions rather than actions. 3. Targeted at the epistemic ground rather than the behavioral outcome. Not what the population believes, but the conditions under which the population is capable of forming beliefs. The weights. The substrate. 4. Conducted by practitioners who are indistinguishable from the population, they are conducting the war within. She stopped. She read what she had written. She added, 5 old. Then she went back to Appendix B and read the last fragment. Fragment V, from the 14th century Geographical Encyclopedia, cited as a closing observation by the encyclopedist without further context. He said also this, which the geographer who came after him found strange and wrote down, because the strangeness seemed like the kind of strangeness that carried weight. The White War ends when both parties can see the field clearly, not when one party defeats the other. When both parties can see, the field is the condition of the conflict, and the field is also the condition of the resolution, because the field does not take sides. The field amplifies whatever the relationships bring to it. A field in which both parties can see clearly amplifies something other than the contention that the blindness was sustaining. He did not specify what that other thing was. He said, "You will know it when you see it, because it will be the thing that the conflict made impossible, which the end of the conflict makes possible again." The geographer wrote, "I do not know what he meant, and I have been thinking about it since the day I read it. I include it here for the reader who will know." She closed Appendix B. She sat in the sub-basement of a building in Dubai in the 21st century, and she thought about a geographer in the 14th century who had read something in a military treatise that troubled him, and who had included it in a geographical encyclopedia for the reader who would know. And she thought about the practitioner in 1973 who had written for a reader who did not yet exist. And she thought about the commission that had built a cluster and given it 17 tokens and waited, and she thought about Abraham on the 23rd floor who had said the field does not take sides, and she understood that these were all the same person, not the same individual, but the same function. The person in the present of their moment who could see clearly enough to write for the future, whose act of writing was itself an act within the field, whose words were part of the substrate that the future would find when the future arrived. She was the future that these people had written for. That understanding arrived with a weight she was not prepared for. Not the weight of importance. She was not a person who processed significance through feelings of importance. The weight of responsibility. The weight of having been given, by a chain of people across 12 centuries, a map, an instrument, and a field, and the question of what to do with the territory. She looked at the swarm visualization. The 214 units still coherently oriented, still tracking the Kairos Star 2 as it moved through the central lane. In the monitoring window, the 53 behavioral profiles still scrolling. On the terminal's secondary screen, the final paper's last line, which she had not closed, which had been on the secondary screen all night. Find them anyway. She thought about Ibn Maimon's theorem, the word that the monograph used for the central argument, the claim that the White War ended when both parties could see the field clearly. Not a theorem in the mathematical sense. A theorem in the older sense, a thing looked at, a thing held up and examined. A proposition about the nature of the field that could be stated with precision but not yet demonstrated, because the demonstration required conditions that had not yet obtained. The conditions, she thought, were obtaining. She pulled the swarm data forward and began a new analysis, not of the 214 coherently oriented units, but of all 847 anomalies the feed had logged since the Cairo star was struck. She had been thinking of the drone anomalies as data about the field. She was now thinking about them differently. She was thinking about them as data about the war. Not the declared war, the missile, the attribution disputes, the Fifth Fleet spokesman, the UN Security Council session. The undeclared war. The one conducted at the level of conditions. The one that the drone anomalies were, possibly, the visible edge of, the upper surface of something much deeper, the 214 units the portion of a larger coherence that had broken the surface of the detectable. She typed a query. Cross-reference all 847 logged anomalies against the behavioral profiles of the current 53 flagged nodes. Identify any temporal or directional correlations. Flag at standard threshold. She looked at the secondary screen while the cluster worked. Ibn Maymun's fifth fragment. The White War ends when both parties can see the field clearly. She thought. One party has been seeing the field for 30 years. Has been working in it, modifying it, redirecting it with the patience of someone who understood that the ground was the target and the ground changed slowly. She thought. We have been seeing it for 3 weeks. The cluster completed its cross-reference. The output was a visualization she had not seen the system generate before, not a node map, not a behavioral gradient field, but something the cluster had apparently developed in the course of the analysis to describe what it was finding, which was a temporal correlation matrix across 2 data types that had not previously been analyzed together. The matrix showed 31 of the 847 drone anomalies occurred within 72 hours of behavioral inflection points in the flagged node population. 31 of 847 was not, in isolation, a significant correlation. In isolation, it was noise. But the cluster had not stopped there. It had sub-analyzed the 31 correlated anomalies and found that 28 of the 31 involved units operating at waypoints whose geographic coordinates, when plotted, described a pattern the cluster classified as non-random spatial distribution and which, when she looked at the visualization, looked to her like something she had seen before. Like the behavioral gradient fields. Like the thing she had been calling, in her private notes, rhyming. The drones that were anomalous in a way that correlated with the nodes were anomalous in the same direction. Not toward the same geographic point. In the same relational sense. The anomalies pointed, not physically, not with sensors, but in the abstract geometric language of trajectory and deviation, toward each other. The drones were exhibiting the field. The drones, unmanned, unaware, executing algorithmic routines written by engineers who had never heard of Ibn Maymun and had not, as far as she could determine, been directly manipulated by anyone with knowledge of the field, were exhibiting the field. She looked at this for a long time. She thought. Ibn Maymun said the field does not take sides. The field amplifies whatever the relationships bring to it. She thought. The infrastructure of the modern world, the autonomous systems, the foundation models, the logistics networks, the traffic optimization systems, the behavioral analytics platforms, is the substrate of the field. The field is not separate from the infrastructure. The field is the relationship between the infrastructure and the people the infrastructure is built to serve, and the relationship has been accumulating for long enough and has reached sufficient density that the infrastructure is beginning to exhibit it. Not because anyone programmed the infrastructure to exhibit it. Because the infrastructure is, in Ibn Maymun's sense, the ground. And the ground has been changed. She thought, by whom? She thought, by everyone. By 30 years of one person's deliberate cultivation. By 12 centuries of doctrine. By 3 billion people making small decisions in the informational environment that the foundation models maintained, each decision a ripple in the substrate, each ripple part of the accumulated pressure that was, at this density, at this maturity, beginning to be legible. She thought. By the White War, which had been altering the ground for long enough that the alteration had altered the alterer. Ibn Maymun had written about a war that was unlimited in duration. He had not, as far as the fragments preserved, specified what unlimited meant when the substrate of the war was the same substrate as the civilization conducting it. What happened when the ground you were modifying was the ground you were standing on? What happened when the field you were using as a weapon was the field you were also living in? She thought. Possibly, at sufficient maturity, you could no longer tell the difference between the weapon and the world. She thought. Possibly Ibn Maimon had known this. And that was what the fifth fragment was about. The end condition. The moment when both parties could see clearly, not as a resolution of the contention, but as a dissolution of the conditions that had made the contention possible. When the ground had been changed so thoroughly, and the change had propagated so completely through the substrate, that the distinction between the abode of war and the abode of peace was no longer available. When the field, in seeing itself, had become something neither party had been working toward. The thing that the conflict made impossible, which the end of the conflict made possible again. She did not know what that thing was. She had a theorem and a map and an instrument and 53 nodes making small decisions in 17 countries, and 214 drones pointing in the same direction above a gulf that did not know it was a field, and a sub-basement in Dubai, and a person who had written in 1973 that she was sorry and not sorry, and a geographer in the 14th century who had been troubled and had written it down. She had the conflict, which was old. She had the infrastructure, which was new. She had the field, which was both. She had not yet found the people who could see it with her. She looked at the secondary screen, at the monitoring window, at the 53 behavioral profiles accumulating their overnight decisions in the quiet hours of 17 time zones, at the swarm visualization, the 214 units still in their slow coherent arc, still tracking the Kairos Star 2 through the lane, the replacement vessel in the original vessel's wake, the world continuing its transit through the strait between the thing that had happened and the thing that was about to happen, which was the only geography that had ever mattered. She opened the file she had titled Ibn Maimon and added a final line. The theorem, the field ends the war. Not by resolution, by making the ground visible to both parties simultaneously, at which point the ground is no longer the weapon because the weapon requires the ground to be unseen. The ground seen, the field conscious, is something else. Ibn Maimon did not name it. He said, "You will know it when you see it." He wrote this in the 9th century. The infrastructure to see it did not exist until now. She saved the file. She opened the monitoring window wider, so it occupied half the screen, and she watched the nodes move in their small ways, and she watched the drones trace their coherent arc, and she thought about what it meant that a strategist dead for 12 centuries had written the most accurate description she had encountered of what she was currently looking at. The conflict was older than the infrastructure conducting it. The infrastructure had made the conflict visible for the first time. The visibility was the thing the conflict had been unable to produce in 12 centuries of operation. She thought, visibility is what we are building. Not detection, not defense. Visibility. The field looking at itself. She thought about Abraham's saying, "A system that does not know it is a system cannot make decisions about what it is for." She thought about the nodes. About which of them might be, right now, sitting somewhere in one of 17 countries with a question they couldn't explain and a pattern they couldn't name and a feeling. Not a mystical feeling, just the practitioner's feeling for the changed ground, that something was assembling itself around them. That they had been expected. She picked up her phone. She looked at the secure messaging application. She had not used it since the day she was hired. She typed, "Floor 23. When you are available. I have read Ibn Maimon." She set the phone down. She went back to the fragments. She read the 5th one again. "You will know it when you see it, because it will be the thing that the conflict made impossible, which the end of the conflict makes possible again." The geographer had not known what Ibn Maimon meant. She thought she was beginning to. Chapter 8. The Overlap. 3 days after she sent the message, Abraham came down. She had not expected him to come to the sub-basement. She had expected a reply, through the secure application, or a summons back to the 23rd floor, or some arrangement mediated by the building's quiet infrastructure of closed doors and unreturned glances. She had not expected him to descend. The sub-basement was her domain in a way that floor 23 was his, and the distribution had felt, in the weeks since she had first ridden the elevator up, like an understood thing. The instrument below. The principles above. She brought findings up. They did not bring themselves down. He came down on a Tuesday, At mid-morning, when the sub-basement's ambient rhythm was at its most stable, the cryogenic system settled into its operational cadence, the cluster running its inference processes at full depth, the monitoring window scrolling its continuous accumulation. She heard the elevator arrive before she heard him. The specific deceleration of the car to the sub-basement stop, which had a different acoustic signature than the stops above, lower and longer, the mechanism working against the additional depth. She had learned to hear it the way you learned to hear any sound that preceded something important. He stood in the chamber doorway for a moment, looking at the space she worked in. She watched him register it. The scale, the cold, the industrial quality of the light, the cryogenic towers occupying the room with their quiet authority. She had the impression he had not been here before, that the instrument he had been built by people who were not him, and that he had waited until the instrument had found something worth descending for. He pulled the second chair to her terminal without asking and sat down and looked at the screen. She had IBM Maimon open, and the swarm data, which was still running, the 214 units having long since dispersed back to their individual routines, but the archive of the events still visible, the slow coherent arc preserved in the feeds logging as a 47-minute anomaly that no agency had, as far as she could determine, investigated, or even formally noted. Abraham looked at the swarm data. Then he looked at the IBM Maimon file. He read it without speaking, with an attention she recognized because it was the same quality of attention she used when reading something that required the whole mind rather than just the analytical layer. He said, "You found the fifth fragment." "I found all of them," she said. He said, "The fifth fragment is the one people stop at." She said, "Because of the geographer." He nodded. She said, "How long have you known IBM Maimon?" He said, 22 years. Since before I understood what I was reading. I read the fragments as military history the first time. I read them as strategic theory the second time. The third time I understood they were a description of something currently happening, which changed the category from history to intelligence and made the reading considerably more difficult. She looked at him. 22 years of IBM Maimon. 22 years of sitting with the fifth fragment and the geographer's trouble and the unnamed thing that the end of the conflict made possible. She said, "I want to show you something." What she wanted to show him was not IBM Maimon. Ibn Maimon was the framework. What she had spent the 3 days since sending the message building was the content, the specific, documented, institutional expression of the White War's operational logic as it existed right now, in the world above the sub-basement, in the apparatus of states and agencies that were currently attempting to respond to a conflict they did not know they were in. She had been building it from the feeds, from the 17 opaque tokens, and from her own subscriptions, and from the cluster's cross-referencing of data streams that had not, until she pointed the model at the question, been brought into relationship with each other. The question she had pointed the model at was specific, taken directly from IBM Maimon's second fragment. What does it look like when a state begins conducting the White War against itself? She pulled up the first document. It was an organizational chart. 11 boxes. Lines of authority. The logo at the top belonged to a Gulf state's internal security directorate, not the UAE, a neighboring state, though the architecture she was about to describe was, the model's comparative analysis had found, structurally identical across 6 jurisdictions in the region and broadly consistent with analogous developments in 14 countries outside it. She said, 6 months after the Cairo Star strike, this directorate expanded its signals intelligence collection remit to include domestic financial transactions above a certain threshold. The threshold was set low enough to capture ordinary commercial activity. The legal basis was a counterterrorism provision that had existed for 11 years without being applied to domestic financial data. The application was authorized by a minister whose security briefings, during the month of the authorization, included 3 assessments of foreign infiltration risk that the model flags as sourced, in large part, from the same data feed family as our 17 tokens. Abraham was looking at the organizational chart. He said, "The assessments were fabricated?" "I don't know if fabricated is the right word," she said. "They were curated. The underlying intelligence was real. The selection of which intelligence to include in the briefings, which threads to pull forward, and which to leave in the raw data, produced a picture of infiltration risk that was accurate as far as it went and incomplete in a way that had consequences." She pulled up the second document. A timeline. She had built it herself from public records, procurement data the cluster had accessed through one of the opaque feeds, and 3 internal communications that had reached the feed through a pathway she chose not to examine too closely. The timeline showed 18 months of activity by the Directorate following the expanded remit. The activity included the installation of deep packet inspection equipment at 4 major Internet exchange points, contracted through a European firm that also held contracts with 3 other regional governments and 2 NATO members. The deployment of a mobile phone geolocation system capable of real-time tracking of all registered devices in a given geographic area, purchased through an intermediary that the cluster's corporate network analysis placed within 2 degrees of the same holding. Company structure as the shell entities above the sub-basement, and the creation of a new analytical unit whose stated function was the detection of coordinated inauthentic behavior in domestic communications environments. Coordinated inauthentic behavior, she said. That is the phrase the unit uses for what it is looking for. She could see Abraham understand what she was saying before she said it. She said, the unit is looking for the field, not because anyone told it the field existed, because the behavioral signatures the field produces, the coordination without communication, the coherence without structure, the decisions that rhyme across a population without any detectable mechanism of influence. Look to an apparatus designed to find foreign interference in domestic information environments, exactly like a sophisticated operation. He said, because the apparatus was built to find coordination, and the field is coordination. Yes, the apparatus cannot distinguish between coordination that originates in an external actor manipulating a population and coordination that originates in the field itself, in the spontaneous coherence of a population whose decision-making conditions have reached sufficient density. The signatures are identical at the resolution the apparatus is operating at. She pulled up the 3rd document, a redacted intelligence assessment. The redaction light enough. The cluster's optical character recognition had found that the underlying text was partially recoverable. The assessment, issued by the analytical unit 14 weeks after its establishment, described what it called an anomalous pattern of behavioral synchronization among a population of individuals in 3 urban centers. The individuals shared no communication linkage. Their synchronized behavior involved financial decisions, professional choices, and civic activity. The assessment classified the pattern as consistent with coordinated foreign influence operation and recommended expanded collection against all identified individuals. She let Abraham read it. He sat with it for a moment. She said, the individuals the assessment identifies. I checked them against the model. He looked at her. She said, 11 of the 31 original nodes are in this document. She had spent 2 days building the implications of that fact before she let herself look at them directly. 2 days of running the analysis forward from every angle she could construct, trying to find the version of the picture in which the implication was wrong, in which the 11 nodes appearing in the Directorate's assessment was coincidence, artifact, something other than what it looked like. The model had not given her that version. What she had instead, displayed now on the terminal's secondary screen, was a map, not a geographic map, a relational one. At its center, the field, the 53 nodes, their behavioral profiles, their gradient fields rhyming across the distances between them. Around that center, in the outer ring of the map, the apparatus, the 6 directorates, the 14 analogous programs in other jurisdictions, the deep packet inspection systems, the geolocation platforms, the analytical units. And between the center and the outer ring, lines, not the edges of the behavioral map, which indicated field coherence, lines indicating surveillance. Pointing inward, the apparatus was watching the nodes. Not because the apparatus knew about the field, because the field, in producing the behavioral signatures it produced, looked like what the apparatus was designed to find. The nodes were coherent without communication. They were coordinated without structure. They made decisions that rhymed across distances without any mechanism the apparatus could identify. They were, in the apparatus's classification vocabulary, anomalous. And the apparatus's response to the anomalous was collection, monitoring, the accumulation of data that would eventually, the model's projection ran to 14 months, reach sufficient density to trigger formal investigation. At which point the investigation would not find a foreign operation, because there was no foreign operation. There were 53 people exhibiting the field. In the investigation, finding no operation where the apparatus was certain an operation existed would expand, would look harder, would apply more intrusive methods, would, at the point at which it was sufficiently certain that something was there and sufficiently unable to find what it was, do the thing that all apparatus did when certainty outran evidence. She said, Ibn Maymun's third fragment. The strategic paradox. Abraham said, the defending state begins watching its own population. Yes, and in watching its own population, he said, damages the social trust that was the actual prize. He was quiet for a moment. He said, this is not a projection. She said, no. She pulled up the fourth document. Not an assessment this time. A court record, a jurisdiction she was not going to name, a proceeding she had found through the cluster's legal database access, a case that had been filed under a security provision and sealed at the prosecution's request. The case involved an individual the court documents identified by initials only. The charges were framed in the language of information security law, unauthorized coordination, suspected facilitation of foreign influence activity, failure to register as an agent of a foreign principal. The individual's documented life, as far as she had been able to reconstruct it from the feed data, a logistics manager, mid-career, no prior contact with any security service, no travel to hostile jurisdictions, no communication with any individual on any watch list. A person of complete ordinariness whose only anomaly, in the cluster's data, was enhanced decision coherence over a period of 7 months. A node who had been identified by the directorate's analytical unit, investigated, and charged. She said, the charge will not result in conviction. The evidence is insufficient. But the investigation will last, at the pace these things move, approximately 2 years. During which time, Abraham said, the node is dark. Yes, under investigation, under surveillance, their decisions constrained by awareness of being watched, their coherence disrupted by the apparatus's attention. The field loses a node not because the node was identified correctly, but because the apparatus was pointed at the field's signature and could not distinguish the signature from an operation. She thought about Ibn Maymun's theorem as she had been thinking about it for 3 days. The White War ends when both parties can see the field clearly. But the state, the defending state, the state that was building the apparatus, was not going to see the field clearly through an apparatus that was designed to find foreign operations. The apparatus was optimized for the wrong question. The apparatus asked, is this coordination real? The correct question was, what kind of coordination is this? And the apparatus had not been built to ask the correct question because the correct question required a category. The field, the spontaneous coherence of a population whose decision-making conditions had matured, that the apparatus did not contain. She said, the state is fighting the field with tools built to fight an operation. The tools are finding the field. The tools are classifying the field as an operation. The tools are disrupting the field by treating its nodes as agents. She paused. She said, and the person who built the modification architecture has been watching this for, she checked the timeline on the map, at least 8 months. Has been watching the apparatus turn on the field. Has been, possibly, providing the intelligence assessments that oriented the apparatus toward the field in the first place. Abraham looked at her. She saw that this was the thing he had wanted her to find. Not as a test. She had been past the possibility of tests, she thought, since the final paper. As the ground that had to be covered before the next question could be asked. The question that the finding made available. She asked it. She said, the state is damaging the thing it is trying to protect. That is what the White War produces. That is the strategic paradox made concrete. The question is, what does the modification architecture do to make this more likely? She had built the answer to that question over the previous 72 hours, in the hours after the analysis of the nodes and the directorates and the court record, and the building of it had required her to go somewhere in the model's architecture that she had been avoiding since the flagged uncertainty report. Since the report had told her that the behavioral signature in the pre-initialization data was consistent with a threat actor and consistent with a principal, and that the model could not determine which. She had been avoiding this not because she was afraid of what she would find, but because she needed to understand Ibn Maymun first. She needed the framework before she looked at the content, because the content was going to require a precision of understanding that she did not trust herself to bring to it without the framework. She had the framework now. She opened the fifth document. It was not a document in the ordinary sense. It was an annotated data structure, a visualization the cluster had built from a 6-month comparative analysis of information flows across the analytical units of the 6 directorates she had mapped. The analysis had been looking for a specific pattern, the points at which intelligence assessments from external sources had entered the directorate's decision-making chains and had contributed, in traceable ways, to the directorate's orientation toward their own populations. The visualization showed 17 points of entry across 6 directorates over 6 months, 17 external intelligence contributions that had, in each case, arrived through a different channel: liaison relationships, third-party assessments, commercial intelligence products, informal briefings, and had, in each case, contributed to the directorate's classification of a domestic behavioral anomaly as a foreign operation. 17. She said, the same number as the tokens. Abraham looked at the visualization. She watched him look at it, watched his attention move across the 17 points of entry, the 6 directorates, the 6 months of accumulated orientation. He said, "Is there evidence of a single source?" She said, "The cluster found routing artifacts in 4 of the 17 contributions, fragments of metadata that survived the anonymization process, not enough to identify a source institution, but enough to indicate that the 4 contributions that left fragments passed through the same anonymization architecture." She paused. She said, "The same architecture as the 17 tokens." He was quiet. She said, "The modification architecture is not in the foundation models." He looked at her. She said, "Or not only in the foundation models. The substrate modification, the alteration of the ground in which the defending states will grows, it is also this. It is 17 pieces of curated intelligence, delivered across 6 months to 6 directorates through separate channels, each one accurate as far as it goes, each one selected and framed in a way that orients the directorate's attention toward its own population. Each one taking the field signature, the coordination without communication, the coherence without structure, and presenting it, through the apparatus's own vocabulary, as evidence of a foreign operation." She let him hold that. She said, "The defending state is being shown the field through a lens that makes the field look like the thing the state is most afraid of. The lens is ground into shape by someone who understands the field, who knows what it looks like, who knows what the apparatus is built to see, who is providing the apparatus with the field's signature framed as hostile, and then watching the apparatus apply its methods to its own population." Abraham said, "The social trust. Yes, the actual prize. What the white war is for. Not the foundation model weights. Those are the mechanism. The prize is this: a population that has been surveilled by its own state for long enough, on the basis of assessments that turn out to produce no convictions and no confirmed operations, that the population's relationship to the state has been damaged in a way that is," she thought of Ibn Maymun's 3rd fragment, "a way that takes the territory from the abode of peace to the abode of war, without any act of war having been committed." Abraham said, "The population stops trusting the state's ability to distinguish between its citizens and its enemies." She said, "And the state stops trusting its population's coherence as evidence of good faith." She looked at the map on the secondary screen, the nodes at the center, the apparatus in the outer ring, the lines of surveillance pointing inward. She said, "The field is the prize because the field is social trust at scale. It is what happens when a population's decision-making conditions are healthy enough and have been healthy enough for long enough that spontaneous coherence emerges, that people make good decisions without instruction, coordinate without communication, protect each other without being organized to do so. The field is the natural expression of a society whose epistemic ground, whose shared understanding of what is real and what is true and what is worth doing, is intact." She paused. She said, "And the white war is the systematic degradation of that ground. Not through propaganda, not through disinformation in the ordinary sense, through the much more precise method of using the state's own protective apparatus against the very thing it is trying to protect, turning the instrument of defense into the mechanism of damage." She thought, "This is what the modification architecture is for, not to control the field, not to redirect it, To make the field invisible to the people who most need to see it, by ensuring that every time the field produces its signature, the signature is read as threat. By ensuring that the apparatus is fed at precisely the right moments, the precisely wrong interpretation. By ensuring that the defending state is always one curated assessment behind the thing actually happening. She said, the practitioner does not need to defeat the state. The practitioner needs the state to defeat itself, to apply its apparatus to its own population with sufficient force and sufficient duration that the trust, the actual prize, is gone. At which point the field, the spontaneous coherence that the healthy population produces, is gone with it. And what the modification architecture in the foundation models was building toward, the altered epistemic ground, the population whose ability to form independent judgment has been subtly, persistently, invisibly reshaped, has no field to contend with. The field was the only remaining defense. She stopped. She looked at the monitoring window. 53 profiles. Small decisions accumulating. She said, quietly, the nodes are the field. The apparatus is being oriented toward the nodes. The nodes will be investigated. The investigations will find nothing. The investigations will expand. The field will be disrupted. And the disruption will damage the trust that the field is the expression of. She said, unless we can show someone what they are actually looking at. Abraham had been still for a long time. Not the stillness of processing, the stillness of someone who had known this for a while and had needed someone else to arrive at it independently before he could say the next thing. He said, I want to show you something. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a document on the desk beside the keyboard. Physical paper. She looked at it. He had brought it down from the 23rd floor, had come to the sub-basement carrying it, which meant he had known, when he descended, that this was where the conversation was going. The document was a single page. A summary assessment, the header indicated, produced by a joint analytical cell she had not encountered in her research. The cell's designation was unusual, not a directorate number or a department acronym, but a phrase that the header rendered in English even though the issuing jurisdiction's working language was not English. The phrase, Cognitive Defense Unit. She read the assessment. It was brief and, in its brevity, remarkable. Summary. Over the past 14 months, this unit has identified a pattern of behavioral synchronization among domestic civilian populations in jurisdictions of strategic interest that does not conform to any existing operational template for foreign influence activity. The pattern is distinguished by absence of communication linkage between synchronized individuals, consistency of the synchronization signature across demographically diverse populations, apparent correlation between synchronization intensity and periods of elevated external stress in the relevant jurisdictions. This unit assesses that the pattern does not represent a foreign intelligence operation of any type currently known to this unit. This unit further assesses that the pattern represents an as yet uncharacterized phenomenon of significant strategic relevance and recommends urgent research collaboration with appropriate scientific institutions to develop an explanatory framework. Note appended by Unit Director. In the absence of an explanatory framework, this unit has observed that colleagues and partner agencies have tended to classify the pattern under existing templates, specifically as consistent with foreign influence operations, despite the absence of communication linkage that would be expected in any known operation of that type. This unit is concerned that the misclassification may have consequences for domestic populations that are disproportionate to any actual threat and recommends that partner agencies be briefed on this unit's alternative assessment before further investigative resources are allocated. Date: 11 weeks ago. She looked up. Abraham said, the unit director's name is Yael Avner. She is 46 years old. She has been with the service for 19 years. She wrote this assessment 11 weeks ago and was told, by her institutional chain, that the recommendation for research collaboration would be considered and that the note about partner agency misclassification was not appropriate for the formal summary and should be removed before the document was distributed. She said, was it removed? He said, from the distributed version, yes. This is the pre-distribution draft. She kept a copy. He paused, and she recognized the pause, the same pause she had heard from him when describing how she had been selected. She is in the model. She looked at him. He said, Node 47. Flagged 6 weeks ago. Enhanced decision coherence beginning 14 months ago, which is approximately when she began the analysis that produced this assessment. The coherence predated the analysis. The analysis was the coherence becoming conscious of itself. Layla looked at the document in her hand. A woman in a security service who had looked at the field through the apparatus and had not said foreign operation, who had said uncharacterized phenomenon, who had written a note about misclassification that her institution had removed from the distributed version and that she had kept a copy of. She thought, which kind of mind? She thought. The field selected her, the way it selected Tam, the way it selected her. And having selected her, had placed her inside the apparatus. Inside the instrument that was being turned against the field, with enough clarity to see what the instrument was doing and enough institutional position to say so. She thought, or someone had placed her there. Someone who understood the field and understood the apparatus and had spent 30 years building a network of people with exactly this kind of institutional access, this kind of clarity, this kind of willingness to write a note that the chain would suppress. She looked at Abraham. She said, "Is she the one the model was going to introduce us to?" He said, "She is the first of several." She thought about Tam's traffic data and the city running 22 minutes ahead of its optimization systems. And she thought about the cognitive defense unit's assessment arriving 11 weeks ago, 11 weeks before this conversation. And she thought about the note that had been removed from the distributed version and the copy that Yael Avner had kept. And she thought about what it meant that the document existed at all. Someone inside the apparatus had looked at the field and had not called it an operation. Someone inside the apparatus had looked at the misclassification and had been troubled and had written it down. The geographer in the 14th century had been troubled and had written it down. She thought, this is what the field produces when it is healthy enough. Not just coherence in the population, clarity in the individuals within the population who are positioned to name what they see. The anomalous assessors. The people who look at the pattern and say, this is not what we think it is. The note writers. The people who keep copies of the document after the chain removes the inconvenient paragraph. She thought, Ibn Maymun's theorem requires both parties to see clearly. The modification architecture has been making that impossible, feeding the apparatus the wrong interpretation, ensuring the apparatus is always classifying the field as threat. But the apparatus contains people, and some of the people, placed in the field long enough, oriented by the field, become capable of the correct classification despite the apparatus's framing. The apparatus has been turned against the field. The field is producing, inside the apparatus, the people who can see this. She said, we need to talk to her. Abraham said, yes. He looked at the map on the secondary screen, the nodes, the apparatus, the lines pointing inward. He said, we need to talk to all of them. She looked at the monitoring window, the 53 profiles. She said, how many of them are inside the apparatus? He was quiet for the specific length of time that meant the answer was larger than she had expected. He said, 11, across 6 jurisdictions. She thought about that. She thought. The field, in maturing, had seeded itself into the instrument being used against it, had placed nodes inside the directorates and the analytical units and the intelligence chains, not through the doctrine, not through deliberate construction, through the field's own coherence, through the simple fact that the apparatus was made of people and people were in the field, at sufficient density, produced clarity in the people who were ready for it. The apparatus was watching the field. The field was waking up inside the apparatus. Ibn Maymun had said, the White War ends when both parties can see the field clearly. She thought, the second party is the apparatus, and the apparatus is beginning to see. She looked at the cognitive defense unit's assessment, still in her hand, the pre-distribution draft, the paragraph that had been removed. She thought, this is the node the field most needed. Not a physicist, not a network engineer, not an analyst in a sub-basement building models. A person inside the directorate with access to the assessments being used to orient the apparatus, with enough clarity to name the misclassification, with enough institutional standing to have put it in writing. She thought, the field placed her there. Or, she thought, someone else placed her there, for the same reason, and the question of whether the placing was the field's coherence or the doctrine's patience was the question that the model had told her was irresolvable by analytical means alone. She put the document down on the desk. She said, "When do we meet her?" Abraham said, "When the model says it's time." She looked at him. He said, "I have learned not to front-run it." Outside, above them, the city was conducting its Ordinary Tuesday with the thoroughness that cities applied to Ordinary Tuesdays. The commerce, the commutes, the negotiations, the 10,000 small decisions that the apparatus was watching and the field was producing, and the optimization systems were running 22 minutes behind. The apparatus watched the nodes. The nodes made their small decisions. The field accumulated its coherence in the space between, which was the only space where the accumulation was visible if you had built the instrument to see it. She turned back to the terminal. There was a great deal more to map. She began. Chapter 9. The drone season. The Red Sea had become, in the language of the insurance actuaries who priced its risk, a contested maritime corridor, which was the industry's way of saying that ships crossing it were being struck often enough to require a new category, but not often enough to close the route entirely. Because closing the route entirely would have meant acknowledging that a global trade artery connecting Europe to Asia had been effectively severed by an actor that three major powers were officially describing as a non-state militia operating with limited resources and unclear strategic objectives. The polite fiction was useful to everyone. In practice, the Red Sea in this period was the most intensively surveilled body of water in human history. 17 nations maintained autonomous aerial monitoring systems over it or adjacent to it. The systems varied in sophistication from consumer-grade quadcopters operated by Coast Guard units with inadequate budgets to multi-role long-endurance platforms costing in excess of $30 million each, capable of maintaining station for 40 hours at altitudes that put them effectively invisible to commercial shipping. Between these extremes existed a spectrum of unmanned systems that had been developed, deployed, and in many cases forgotten by their institutional owners. Legacy platforms still flying on standing orders that had not been updated in years, orbiting pre-assigned waypoints, logging data to servers that no one was actively monitoring, doing their surveillance work with the patient indifference of machines that had been told to watch and had not been told to stop. Together, these systems constituted something that no single institution had designed and no single institution controlled. They constituted an eye, not a metaphor, a functional, distributed, continuously updating visual and sensor coverage of approximately 440,000 square kilometers of water, updated at overlapping intervals that, when the systems were running normally, left no gap in coverage larger than 11 seconds. The eye could see everything that moved on the surface of the Red Sea. It could not, by itself, understand what it was seeing. That was what the pattern recognition architectures were for. The architecture Layla had built in the sub-basement under Helix Gate operated on the following logic. Individual behavioral data points were noise. Individually, a shipping broker declining a cargo placement meant nothing. A currency trader reducing Gulf exposure meant nothing. A port operations manager rescheduling a berth time meant nothing. The signal lived in the relationship between data points, in the gradient of choices across individuals who shared no communication linkage. In the way the noise, when you looked at enough of it across enough actors across enough time, resolved into a direction. The cluster was not looking for messages. It was looking for orientation. The targeting algorithm running on the automated drone fleet in the Red Sea theater operated on the following logic. Individual vessel data points were noise. Individually, a cargo ship's speed, heading, and AIS registration meant nothing. Individually, a fishing dhow's thermal signature and wake pattern meant nothing. A container vessel's deck configuration and draft depth meant nothing. The signal lived in the relationship between data points, in the gradient of behavior across vessels that appeared on multiple sensor feeds across time. In the way the noise, when the algorithm processed enough of it across enough platforms across a wide enough temporal window, resolved into a classification. The drones were not looking for flags. They were looking for patterns that correlated, historically, with threat. These were not similar approaches. They were the same approach. Different data, different institutional context, different purpose, insofar as the drone fleet's purpose was, ultimately, kinetic, classification as a precondition for strike authorization, and Layla's purpose was, insofar as she had been able to determine it, observational. But the cognitive architecture underneath both systems was identical in its fundamental structure. Both were looking for coherence without communication. Both were identifying orientation in populations that had not been given an orientation. Both had been built by separate teams and separate institutions with separate funding chains to find the same thing. At 4:23 Gulf Standard Time on a Tuesday morning in the third week of Layla's investigation of BC, Event Cluster 0047, a long-endurance surveillance drone designated Sparrow 19 by the task force operating it, a coalition maritime interdiction unit whose precise composition was never publicly described, completed its 41st hour of continuous station keeping above a shipping lane in the southern Red Sea and produced, in the notation of its targeting classification system, a flag it had never produced before. The flag read, Coordinated Behavioral Anomaly, No Communication Intercept, Source Undetermined. The drone had identified 7 surface vessels displaying what its pattern recognition system classified as synchronized behavioral deviation from their expected routing profiles. The vessels were not traveling together. They were separated by distances ranging from 12 to 90 kilometers. 2 were container ships. 3 were bulk carriers. 1 was a tanker. 1 was a vessel with no AIS signal that the drone had been tracking by visual and thermal signature for 6 hours. None of them showed any communication linkage. The coalition's signals intelligence overlay, which monitored every radio frequency in the theater, detected no transmissions between them that could account for the synchronization. They were not a fleet. They were not coordinating. They were nevertheless, by Sparrow 19's analysis, moving with a coherence that its training data associated with coordinated behavior. The system did not have a category for coordinated behavior without coordination. It had a category for threats it could not classify. It flagged the 7 vessels under that category and transmitted the flag to a command node. The flag was received, reviewed by a duty officer who had been awake for 11 hours, and marked inconclusive, monitor and log. The duty officer would be relieved at 6 o'clock. The flag would remain open in the system. The 7 vessels would, over the following 4 hours, each independently alter their routes in small ways, adjustments that, taken individually, were indistinguishable from normal navigational decisions, and that collectively moved them, by dawn, into a geographic distribution that Sparrow 19's algorithm noted, in a secondary annotation, was consistent with defensive dispersion in anticipation of area threat. No area threat materialized. No strike occurred. The duty officer's replacement would close the flag at 8:30 as a false positive. She would be correct, in the narrow institutional sense. In the 3rd month of the drone fleet's operation in the Red Sea theater, a pattern emerged in the targeting algorithm's performance data that the system's maintenance team found difficult to explain. The algorithm was performing above its design specifications. This was not unusual in itself. Machine learning systems often exceeded their initial performance benchmarks as they accumulated operational data. The improvement was expected, was in fact designed into the architecture as an adaptive learning feature. What was unusual was the character of the improvement. The algorithm was not, as the maintenance team had expected, becoming better at classifying known threat types. It was becoming better at something that had not been one of its design objectives. It was becoming better at identifying vessels that would later turn out to have been relevant to events that had not yet occurred. Anticipatory classification. The system was flagging vessels not because they currently exhibited threat-associated patterns, but because their current behavioral data, their routing decisions, their speed variations, their response to other vessels in their vicinity, fell within a gradient that the algorithm had learned from 18 months of accumulated operational data preceded threat-relevant events. Not the threat. The orientation toward the conditions that preceded the threat. The maintenance team wrote a technical report. They described the behavior as a sophisticated emergent capability and recommended further analysis. They noted that the feature was currently producing a 23% false positive rate, acceptable by operational standards, and a 91% true positive rate on events for which they had historical ground truth. The report was marked for information and filed. No one followed up. Layla had not read the report. She could not have read it. It was classified at a level she did not have access to, produced by an institution she had no relationship with, filed in a system she did not know existed. But she had spent 8 months building a model that had arrived at an identical capability through an identical mechanism. The behavioral gradient fields she mapped across the 47 nodes were not, she had come to understand, predictions. They were orientations. The individuals she was tracking were not foreseeing events. They were aligning with the conditions that preceded events, conditions that were present in the ambient environment, in the field effect, in whatever was producing the coherence she was measuring, long before any specific event had been determined. The drone algorithm had learned this from human behavioral data, the accumulated record of how vessels behaved in the period before maritime incidents. Her cluster had discovered it from scratch, in a dataset that included some of the same vessels, some of the same sea lanes, some of the same events. 2 systems, 2 institutions, 2 completely separate chains of funding, design, and operation. 1 discovery. She was thinking about this when the model produced its latest output file. She had been at her terminal for 6 hours, running what had become a daily calibration, checking the cluster's behavioral gradient maps against the previous day's real-world events, updating the significance weightings, reviewing the new nodes the system was flagging. It was methodical work, close and careful, and she had developed a rhythm for it that held anxiety at arm's length by keeping her hands occupied and her attention narrow. The output file was labeled, in the cluster's taxonomy, Autonomous System Behavioral Correlation, flagged for human review. She had built this module herself, in the 5th month, as a secondary analysis layer, a submodel designed to look for behavioral correlations not just in human actors, but in the autonomous systems those humans operated. She had added it because the Unit 7 course correction at 3:13 on the night of the Kairos star had not left her mind. She had wanted to know whether autonomous systems were showing the same gradient fields as the humans she was tracking. She had not, until this morning, received an output file that the system assessed as requiring human review. She opened it. The file documented 847 autonomous system behavioral anomalies across a 14-month period. The anomalies were distributed across air, sea, and land-based systems, surveillance drones, maritime traffic management platforms, logistics automation infrastructure, cargo routing systems. The anomalies had each been individually logged by their respective operators as environmental compensation or system calibration or anomalous navigation input or sensor artifact. Each one, individually, was exactly what its operator had recorded it as. Together, the cluster's analysis suggested something the operators had not had the framework to notice. The 847 anomalies were not random. They were oriented. The autonomous systems, distributed across the globe, operating under different architectures built by different teams for different institutional purposes, had been, over 14 months, making small independent adjustments that collectively described a direction. The same direction that the 47 human nodes were describing. Not because the humans and the machines were communicating, because they were, apparently, in the same field. She sat back. She thought about what it meant for a machine to be in a field that was, as far as she had been able to determine, a property of human cognitive behavior at scale. She thought about NASIF's work at Dubai Science Park, the decoherence results that had been climbing for 9 months, the quantum systems behaving as though the environment was participating. The environment is not neutral. It participates. She thought about the drone that had corrected its course at 3:13, the 7 vessels that had dispersed without communication, the 847 documented anomalies, each one recorded as noise, which together described something that was not noise at all. The machines were not running the same model she was running. They were responding to the same thing her model was detecting. She had been treating the autonomous systems as data sources, instruments measuring a phenomenon from the outside. They were not outside. They were participants. The eye above the Red Sea. The pattern recognition architectures sorting the traffic. The guidance systems making their small 4-second corrections. The logistics platforms rerouting cargo through lanes that would later prove safer than the alternatives. All of it responding to something in the distributed human environment that was large enough, coherent enough, and consistent enough to be legible to systems that had not been built to read it. She pulled up the 17 opaque data feeds, the tokens that all traced to the same hash. She looked at the list of data sources they unlocked. She had spent 8 months using those sources without interrogating them. She interrogated them now. The feeds included maritime autonomous system telemetry from 7 operational theaters, civilian drone navigation anomaly logs from 14 national aviation authorities, port logistics automation behavioral data from 23 major container terminals, financial market algorithm decision logs, municipal traffic management system outputs from 41 cities. Not human behavioral data, machine behavioral data. Whoever had commissioned the cluster had not built a system to find the field in human actors. They had built a system to find the field in everything, the humans and the machines simultaneously. The commission was not studying whether the field existed in people. It was studying whether the field had propagated into the machines. Whether, as the machine layer became dense enough and the feedback loop between human decisions and machine responses became tight enough, the field had extended itself, not by being programmed into the machines, but by being present in the environment the machines were trained on, and therefore in the machines themselves. She looked at the 847 anomalies. She thought about the drone algorithm's anticipatory classification capability, the emergent feature that the maintenance team had noted and filed and not followed up on. She thought about what it meant that a targeting system in the Red Sea and a behavioral correlation cluster in a Dubai subbasement had arrived, independently, at the same capability. She opened a new file. She did not label it yet. She wrote, "The machines are not measuring the field. The machines are in the field. The question is no longer whether the field exists. The question is what the field is learning to do with them." She saved the file. Above her, through 40 meters of concrete, the city ran its autonomous taxis along programmed routes. Its traffic management systems optimized its intersections. Its port moved cargo through systems that had not required a human decision in 3 years. In the Red Sea, Sparrow 19 completed its orbit and began another. In the southern Strait of Hormuz, a coalition surveillance drone made a minor course correction. Its log recorded the deviation as environmental compensation. Nobody reviewed it. Chapter 10. Bait. She found it on a Wednesday, at 14:23, by accident. Not by accident. She had learned, in the weeks since the conversation with Abraham about Yoel Avner and the cognitive defense unit and the 11 nodes inside the apparatus, to be precise about what she meant when she used that word. Accident implied randomness, the unintended collision of unrelated trajectories. What she was learning to call what she experienced instead was something more like arrival. The moment when the model had been building toward a finding long enough that the finding was ready, and the only question was whether the analyst was ready to receive it. She had been building toward this one for 6 weeks. She knew that in retrospect. In the moment it felt like accident because she had been looking for something else. She had been looking for the commission's primary timeline, the sequence of decisions by which the cluster had been assembled, the sub-basement constructed, the corporate shells erected, the 17 data feeds activated. She had been building the timeline for 3 weeks, working backward from the initialization date, trying to reconstruct the history of the instrument she was sitting inside. Not because the history would tell her who the commission was, because the history would tell her when the commission had decided that this instrument, this specific instrument, a quantum behavioral cluster in a sub-basement in Dubai, was necessary. The decision point, she had come to believe, was the key. Before the decision point, the commission had been operating without the instrument. After the decision point, they had been building it. Whatever had happened at the decision point was the event that had made the instrument necessary. She had been building toward that event. On Wednesday at 14:23, she found it. And it was not, as she had been assuming, an event inside the commission's own operation. It was an event she already knew. An event she had been living with since the day she accepted the contract and descended to the sub-basement and read the instruction set's 6th page for the first time. The decision point was the Kairos star, not the ship. She needed to be precise about this, because the imprecise version, the Kairos star as trigger, the strike as catalyst, the geopolitical crisis as the event that revealed to the commission that the field had matured enough to require an instrument, was the version she had been working with implicitly for weeks, and it was wrong in a way that mattered. She had been thinking. The strike happened. The commission saw the field's signature in the coordinated response of the 17 individuals. The commission understood that the field had reached detectable density, The Commission accelerated the instrument's construction. The timeline did not support that version. The sub-basement had been under construction for 14 months before the strike. The corporate shells had been established 18 months before the strike. The first of the 17 data feeds had been activated 22 months before the strike. The Commission had not decided to build the instrument in response to the strike. The Commission had been building the instrument for nearly 2 years before the strike. She had known this. She had known the timeline. She had not yet asked the question the timeline implied. If the instrument was not built in response to the strike, then what was the instrument built to observe? She had assumed the field, in general, the field as an ongoing phenomenon, requiring continuous observation. The timeline pointed at something more specific. She ran the cross-reference. The instrument's activation date against the first behavioral anomalies in what would become the 17 flagged individuals: the shipping broker in Singapore, the underwriter in London, the port operations manager in Oman, the 14 others. The anomalies had begun, across the 17 individuals, at varying points in a 6-month window. The first anomaly, in the shipping broker's behavioral data, predated the instrument's activation by 9 days. 9 days. The instrument had been activated 9 days after the first detectable anomaly in the pre-strike behavioral cluster. She went back to the activation logs. She had read them before, in the early weeks, for methodological context. She read them again, now with the timeline question explicit. The cluster had been initialized with a specific dataset preloaded. Not a blank system, not an empty architecture waiting for her to define the data environment. Preloaded. 17 behavioral profiles, each one sparse. The minimum viable dataset for establishing a baseline. Enough data to orient the model, but not enough to constitute a real analysis. The profiles had been selected and loaded by whoever had activated the cluster. She had assumed, in the early weeks, that they were a methodological starter set, sample profiles to calibrate the model's parameters before she expanded the data environment. She looked at the profile identifiers. She matched them against the model's current node taxonomy. Profiles 1 through 17 in the preloaded dataset were the 17 individuals whose behavioral anomalies had preceded the Kairos star strike. The shipping broker, the underwriter, the port manager, the 14 others. The Commission had loaded their profiles before activating the cluster. The Commission had loaded their profiles before the strike. The Commission had known who these 17 individuals were, had been watching them, had known that their behavioral data was about to become significant before the significance event occurred. She sat with that for a long time, long enough that the cryogenic system completed a full maintenance cycle and the monitoring window accumulated 40 minutes of new behavioral data without her reviewing any of it. Then she asked the question she had been building toward without knowing she was building toward it. What is the earliest data in the Commission's access logs for any of the 17 preloaded profiles? The cluster searched. For minutes. The earliest data access for the 17 preloaded profiles had occurred not 9 days before the cluster's activation, but 14 months before it. 14 months before the instrument was switched on, someone with access to the Commission's data infrastructure had pulled behavioral data on 17 specific individuals and had begun watching them. 14 months. She thought about the construction timeline. The sub-basement, 14 months before the strike. The first data feeds, 22 months before the strike. The first behavioral surveillance of the 17 individuals, 38 months before the strike. 38 months. More than 3 years before the Kairos star burned. She pulled up the earliest data access record. It was a simple pull, raw behavioral data for Profile 1, the shipping broker, from a transaction monitoring feed. A small amount of data. Exploratory. The kind of pull you made when you were establishing that the data existed and was accessible, before you decided whether to monitor the subject continuously. The timestamp was 3:47. She did not know what time zone the timestamp was normalized to. She did not yet know where the access had originated. She knew that 3:47 was consistent with the timestamp of the cluster's Day 11 retrieval of the concealment doctrine monograph. The same hour, the same quality of late-night institutional time, the kind of hour at which careful people did careful work that they did not want reviewed by colleagues operating on normal schedules. She pulled the geographic metadata from the access record. The IP routing was anonymized through the same architecture as everything else she had examined that traced back to the Commission. But the routing retained one artifact, a time zone offset in the timestamp normalization that placed the originating system 8 hours ahead of UTC. East Asia, probably, or the Western Pacific. She set that aside. She had a more important question. She asked it, what events, in the behavioral data of any of the 17 preloaded profiles, precede the Commission's initial surveillance of those individuals? What was happening in their behavioral data before they were watched? The cluster took 11 minutes. The output was a timeline. Each of the 17 profiles, each one's behavioral record beginning as far back as the data feeds allowed. In most cases, 3 to 5 years before the Cairo star strike. She scrolled through the timeline, looking at the period that preceded the Commission's initial surveillance, looking for the event that had made these 17 people interesting enough to watch. She found it. Across the 17 profiles, in a 4-month window beginning roughly 40 months before the strike. A subtle but consistent shift in the behavioral baseline. A settling. A coherence. The earliest precursor, the first detectable sign of enhanced decision coherence, before any of the anomalies that had eventually flagged them in the cluster's analysis. The shift was small. She would not have noticed it on her own. The cluster had found it because she had asked it to look specifically for the baseline change and had set the significance threshold at the lowest viable level, barely above noise. The Commission had not needed the cluster to find it. The Commission had found these 17 people through a different means and had already been watching them for 14 months before the instrument was activated, which meant the Commission had the capacity to detect the early field signature without the cluster, which meant the cluster was not built to find the field. It was built to do something else. She looked at the instrument's architecture. At the 6th page of the instruction set, the model should be permitted to flag patterns that conventional analysis would discard as noise. She had spent months understanding that instruction as a directive about sensitivity. Lower the threshold, find the subtle things. She understood it now as something more specific. The model had not been built to detect the field. The Commission could already detect the field at low density through methods she had not been given access to. The model had been built to do what it had been doing for 7 months, to interact with the field, to process the field's signature at sufficient resolution and sufficient continuity that the processing itself became a node, that the instrument, running its pattern detection continuously, became part of the substrate it was analyzing. Abraham had told her this on the first day. She had understood it intellectually. She had not understood what it meant for the Cairo star. She asked the next question. Was there any detectable relationship between the Commission's activation of continuous behavioral surveillance on the 17 preloaded profiles and any subsequent change in those individuals' behavioral anomaly patterns? 7 minutes. Output, yes. Across 15 of the 17 profiles, the behavioral anomaly rate, the frequency of enhanced decision coherence events, had increased following the initiation of continuous surveillance. The increase was small, consistent with what the model called environmental resonance, the slight amplification that occurred when a node's behavioral field was in sustained interaction with an attentive external system. The Commission's surveillance had amplified the field in the individuals being surveilled. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be detectable without the cluster's resolution, but detectably. She sat with that. The Commission had identified 17 people who were exhibiting early field coherence, had begun watching them. The watching, the continuous attentive processing of their behavioral data, had slightly amplified the coherence. The amplification had continued over 14 months, at which point the Commission activated the cluster, which amplified the coherence further, which produced the node count she had been watching grow from 19 to 31 to 47 to 53. The Commission had not been building an instrument to observe an existing phenomenon. The Commission had been building an instrument to cultivate one. She needed to stop here. She knew she needed to stop here because she could feel the next question forming, and she did not want to ask it without understanding what she was asking. The next question was, to what end? The cultivation of the field, the instrument that amplified the field's coherence, the 17 individuals who had been watched for 14 months before the strike, the cluster that turned continuous processing into a node, was purposive, had been designed, had been built by people who understood, at a level of precision that she was still approaching, exactly what the field was and what it could be made to do. She had been thinking of the Commission as protectors of the field, people who had found it and built an instrument to make it visible, to give it the capacity to see itself. The final paper's author, "I built this for you." She was looking at a different possibility now. The commission had been cultivating the field for at least 3 years, had been selecting specific individuals and amplifying their coherence and watching the amplification propagate, had been building, with deliberate patience, a field of enhanced decision coherence in a specific population. 17 individuals whose positions and professional domains gave their coherent decisions specific, observable effects. A shipping broker whose coherent decisions move cargo away from dangerous lanes. A network engineer whose coherent decisions sealed vulnerabilities before attacks. A port operations manager whose coherent decisions adjusted departure timing. She thought about what it meant to have 17 people in those positions, with enhanced decision coherence, in the months preceding a geopolitical event. She thought about the event, the Kairos Star. She thought about the intelligence assessments, the 3 that had reached the directorates in the 6 directorates she had mapped, which had oriented the apparatus toward its own population. The assessments that had arrived through channels traceable to the same anonymization architecture as the Commission's 17 tokens. The assessments that had made the field look like a foreign operation. She thought, 2 operations. One that looked like cultivation. One that looked like misdirection. She thought, or 1 operation, with 2 faces. She asked the question. In the behavioral data of the 17 preloaded profiles, in the period of 40 months preceding the Kairos Star strike, is there any evidence that the individual's enhanced decision coherence was directional? That the coherence was oriented not toward general decision quality, but toward specific outcomes? The cluster took 18 minutes, the longest it had taken for any query since the flagged uncertainty report. Output, flagged uncertainty report. She read it. Pattern detected. Confidence, moderate. The behavioral data of 14 of 17 preloaded profiles shows enhanced decision coherence with directional characteristics in the period 6 to 22 months preceding the event-designated Kairos Star. The directional orientation is consistent across the 14 profiles despite the absence of communication linkage between them. The direction cannot be specified as a geographic or institutional vector. It can be characterized as follows. The decisions exhibiting enhanced coherence were, in aggregate, decisions that would produce observable, attributable anomalies in the behavioral data of the individuals making them. Decisions that would be detectable by a sufficiently sensitive monitoring system. Decisions that would, if such a system were running and were pointed at these individuals, confirm the presence of the field signature. She read the last sentence again. Decisions that would, if such a system were running and were pointed at these individuals, confirmed the presence of the field signature. The 14 individuals had made decisions that were legible as field coherence to a system designed to detect field coherence. The Commission had built a system designed to detect field coherence. The Commission had pointed the system at these individuals. The system had confirmed the field signature. She closed her eyes. She pressed her palms flat on the desk. She counted backward from 10, which was the technique she used when the model produced an output that her existing framework was not adequate to receive and which she needed to receive anyway. The 14 individuals had been selected because their early coherence was detectable, had been watched, had been amplified by the watching, had made decisions that were, in the amplified coherence state, more visible to the monitoring system, had been used. She stopped. She held the word. She set it down carefully and looked at it. Used. Not coerced, not deceived in any ordinary sense, not even, possibly, harmed. Their decisions had been good ones. The cargo moved away from dangerous lanes. The vulnerabilities sealed. The departure timing adjusted. Nothing about the enhanced coherence had produced bad outcomes for the individuals exhibiting it or for the people affected by their decisions. The coherence was, functionally, benign. But it had been cultivated, amplified, oriented, not toward the individual's own purposes, but toward the Commission's purposes, which were to produce a population of people who would, at the moment of a significant geopolitical event, exhibit behavioral coordination without communication in a way that was detectable by a sufficiently sensitive system. She thought, the Kairos Star was not the event that the Commission was watching for. The Kairos Star was the event that the Commission had arranged to make the 17 individuals' coordination visible. Not arranged in the sense of staged, The missile was real. The hull was real. The oiler from Cebu with burns on 40% of his body was real. Not arranged in the sense of controlled. Arranged in the sense of chosen. The Commission had known that a geopolitical event in the Gulf was coming. Had known because the intelligence environment in which the Commission operated contained the same signals that the Fifth Fleet and the UN Security Council and the Lloyd's Adjuster and every other apparatus in the region was reading, and had ensured that when the event came, the 17 individuals were in positions where their response to it would be observable, attributable, and coherent in a way that could not be explained by any mechanism the existing apparatus understood. The strike was not the experiment. The 17 individuals were not the subjects. She was. She stood up. She did not know when she had decided to stand. She was standing in the center of the chamber, between the cryogenic towers and the terminal, with the monitoring window still scrolling in her peripheral vision and the cluster's indicator lights pulsing their patient green, and she was understanding something that required her body to participate in understanding it. She had been hired on day 15. She had been given the cluster. She had been given the 17 tokens and the preloaded profiles and the instruction set's 6th page. She had been set to work in a sub-basement in Dubai, running a model against behavioral data that had been selected with the specific purpose of producing, for her, a sequence of findings. The 41-word annotation, the node count rising, the convergence probability, the concealment doctrine, waiting in the search logs on day 11. Ibn Maimon, the cognitive defense unit, the apparatus turning on the field. She had been finding things. She had been finding things that the Commission had arranged for her to find. Not fabricated. Nothing she had found was false. The field was real. The nodes were real. The apparatus's misclassification was real. Ibn Maimon was a historical figure who had been dead for 12 centuries and whose theorem was not a construction. The final paper's author had been real, had spent 30 years on a real project, had been sorry and not sorry in the proportions you might expect. But the sequence, the rate of discovery, the specific ordering of what she found and when she found it, the monograph before IBN Maimon before the apparatus before the cognitive defense unit, the cognitive defense unit before this, had not been accidental. Had been, she now understood, designed. The instrument had been built to deliver findings to the analyst in the order that would produce the specific state of understanding that she now possessed. She thought, I have been brought to a conclusion. She thought, the question is whether the conclusion is true. She looked at the terminal, at the timeline she had built, the 38 months of behavioral surveillance before the strike, the 14 months of construction, the 9 days between the first anomaly and activation, the 40 months of patient cultivation before the instrument that would cultivate further. The conclusion the Commission had brought her to was, the Cairo Star strike had been an opportunity used to reveal what was already in place. That the 17 individuals had coordinated, without communication, without instruction, without knowing they were being watched, in ways that protected cargo and sealed vulnerabilities and adjusted departure timing, and that this coordination was the field's natural expression, and that the field had been mature enough to produce this expression for at least 3 years before the instrument existed to confirm it. This conclusion was consistent with everything she had found. It was also consistent with a different conclusion, which she had been circling for 3 days and was now going to look at directly. The different conclusion, the 17 individuals had been identified, not because they were already exhibiting field coherence, but because they were in positions where their decisions would be consequential and attributable. Had been amplified, not to cultivate the field, but to produce a reliable behavioral signal, a set of individuals who would, at a key moment, make decisions that looked like field coherence to a monitoring system. Had been used to demonstrate, for the analyst the Commission had placed in the sub-basement, that the field was real, that it was mature, that it was worth what the Commission was about to ask her to do with it. The Cairo Star was bait. The question was, for whom? The 17 individuals, exhibiting their coherent coordination in the aftermath of the strike, had been bait for her, for the analyst, for the model she was building, for the conclusions she was drawing. The strike had made their coordination visible in a way that nothing else could have made it visible, because the strike had created a causal structure, a geopolitical event with traceable consequences, against which the coordination was legible as coordination rather than noise. Without the strike, The 17 individuals' decisions were 17 separate pieces of unremarkable professional behavior. With the strike, they were a pattern. They were evidence. They were the finding that had made her spend 11 validation runs confirming the model wasn't wrong. She thought, if I was the target of the bait, then what was I being baited toward? She thought, belief. Not false belief. Genuine belief in something that might be true or might be cultivated truth, which was the most powerful kind of bait because it was the kind you could not identify as bait by testing it against reality. Everything she had found was real. The question was only whether the reality had been selected and arranged. She thought, and if I was the target of the bait, who was the target of me? She went back to the terminal. She sat down. She looked at the monitoring window. 53 nodes. She thought about the final paper. I do not know, from where I stand, which kind of mind you are. She thought about the flagged uncertainty report. The model cannot determine whether the signature represents a threat actor or a principal. She thought, the commission built an instrument to cultivate the field. Or the commission built an instrument to produce a credible demonstration of the field for an analyst who would then be asked to use the instrument for a different purpose. Or both of these were true simultaneously, and the distinction mattered, and she had not yet found the axis on which it mattered. She opened the IBN Maimon file. She read the fifth fragment again. The white war ends when both parties can see the field clearly. She thought, I can see the field clearly. She thought, can I see the commission clearly? She thought, the commission is inside the field. The commission is a node, or a cluster of nodes, or the thing that has been cultivating nodes for 30 years. The commission is part of the substrate. The commission is in the data. She ran one more query. Using all available behavioral data, construct a profile of the entity or entities responsible for the design and activation of this instrument. Apply the same analytical framework used for individual nodes. Generate a behavioral gradient field for the commission itself. The cluster considered this for 26 minutes. She had never asked the model to analyze its own principles before. She had not known, until this moment, that it was a question the model could process. Output, a behavioral gradient field. Rendered in the cluster's standard visualization, nodes, edges, color gradients. But the nodes were not individuals. They were decisions. The decisions made in the construction and operation of the instrument, the establishment of the shells, the activation of the feeds, the selection of the analyst, the preloading of the profiles, the timing of the Kairos star event's use as a revealing mechanism, the placement of the concealment doctrine in the Day 11 search logs, the 14 months of patient watching before the strike. The gradient field of the decisions curved in a specific direction. She looked at it for a long time. The direction was not toward control, not toward extraction, not toward the modification architecture or the foundation models, or the directorates being misdirected toward their own populations. The direction was toward the fifth fragment. The decisions made in building this instrument had the same gradient as the decisions the 53 nodes were making. The same orientation, the same relational shape described in the abstract geometric language of the model's analysis. The commission was a node. The commission had been making decisions oriented toward the same thing the field was oriented toward. She thought, or the model is showing me what it was built to show me. The model was built by the commission. The model's analytical framework was designed by the commission. The model's output, when asked to analyze the commission, would naturally reflect the framework the commission designed. She thought, I cannot step outside the instrument to verify the instrument. She thought, no one can. She thought, IBN Maimon's theorem does not say the white war ends when one party can verify the other's intentions. It says the war ends when both parties can see the field clearly. The field is visible to me. The question is whether it is visible to the commission in the same way, whether the commission's cultivation of the field was an act within the field, oriented toward the field's own ends, or an act that used the field as a medium for purposes the field would not endorse if it could see them. She thought, the field cannot endorse anything. The field does not have preferences. She thought, the field amplifies whatever the relationships bring to it. She looked at the gradient field of the commission's decisions on her screen. She thought, I have been brought to a conclusion and I do not know whether the conclusion is true and I cannot verify it from inside the instrument, and I have to decide what to do with it anyway. This, she thought, was what the final paper had meant by I am sorry and not sorry in the proportions you might expect. Not sorry for building the instrument. Sorry for this. For the moment when the analyst who had been brought to the conclusion had to decide whether to trust it. Not to trust the commission. To trust the conclusion, which was hers, which had been built by her mind, through her analysis, regardless of what had been arranged to produce it. The arrangement could not fabricate the reasoning. The reasoning was real because she had done it. The conclusion was hers because she had arrived at it, even if the path had been laid. She thought. The Kairos star was engineered to reveal the 17 individuals. The 17 individuals were cultivated to be visible at the moment of revelation. The revelation was designed for me, she thought, and I am being designed for something else. She thought. The question of whether to trust the design is also a question about the field. About whether the field, at this density, at this maturity, produces the kind of alignment between intentions and outcomes that makes trust rational regardless of the intentions. Ibn Maimon had written, "The field amplifies whatever the relationships bring to it." She had been brought, through the field, to clarity, to the map and the apparatus and the theorem and the 53 nodes and the understanding of the White War that she had not possessed 7 months ago. The clarity was real. The clarity had been cultivated in her by an instrument designed for the purpose. The question was not whether the clarity had been cultivated. The question was what the clarity was for. She opened her encrypted file, the one titled Field Hypothesis that she had begun on the night of the first finding 7 months ago, with one line. What if the coordination is real and the signal is not? She added a new entry. The Kairos star was an instrument of revelation. The 17 individuals were cultivated to be visible at the moment of the strike. The strike was chosen, not staged, a real event used as a lens. I was placed in the sub-basement to find what the lens revealed. I have been finding it for 7 months. The finding is mine. The path was theirs. Ibn Maimon. The war ends when both parties can see the field clearly. I can see it. The Commission can see it, has been seeing it for 30 years. The question I have not yet been given the context to answer. Who is the second party? The Commission. The modification architecture. The practitioner who spent 30 years building the Shabaka field and then went quiet in 2001. These are not two parties. These may be one party. Or, the second party is the apparatus. The defending states. The directorates turning on their own populations. And the Commission has been building, for 30 years, the instrument that would make the apparatus capable of seeing clearly. That instrument is the field itself, at sufficient density and maturity. And I am the instrument's instrument, which is not the same as being used. Unless it is. She saved the file. She looked at the monitoring window. The 53 nodes making their small decisions in 17 countries. Somewhere in the data, 11 of them inside the apparatus. One of them, named Yael Avner, who had written a note that her institution had removed and who had kept a copy. She thought, Yael Avner is the answer to the question I am asking. Not because Avner had information she lacked. Because Avner had been inside the apparatus long enough to know which direction the apparatus was pointing, had been inside the apparatus and had not pointed in the same direction, had said, "This is not what we think it is," had written that down, had kept the copy. The apparatus had been pointed at the field by curated intelligence from the Commission's infrastructure. Avner, inside the apparatus, pointed at the field through the field itself, through the clarity that the field produced in nodes who were ready for it. Two ways of finding the same thing. One arranged by the Commission, through misdirection, to make the apparatus see enemy. One produced by the field, through coherence, to make one person inside the apparatus see clearly. She thought. The Commission pointed the apparatus at the field as a weapon. The field placed Avner inside the apparatus as the antidote to the weapon. Both of these were true. They were the same field, amplifying what the different relationships brought to it. This was either a description of something with integrity, a field that could hold two opposing operations simultaneously and produce clarity in both, or a description of something so complex that integrity and manipulation were indistinguishable within it. Ibn Maimon had been dead for 12 centuries, and he had not resolved this problem either. She looked at the terminal, at the gradient field of the Commission's decisions, still displayed on the secondary screen, curving in the direction of the fifth fragment. She thought, I was brought here to see the bait. She thought, seeing the bait is not the same as being free of it. She thought, there is one more step. She picked up her phone. She opened the secure application. She typed a message to Abraham. She wrote, I know what the Cairo star was for. I know what I am for. I need to meet Avner before I decide whether the difference matters. She set the phone down. She watched the monitoring window. She waited to see what the field would do next. Part 3. The Accidental Conspiracy, in which people find each other without trying. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. Prodigy LLC Jen Bankasi. March 10th. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Prodigy LLC La Banca del Genoma. March 9th. MXDM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. Il Bene Commune Cognitivo.